Peter, I just realised, of course, looking at that title, I've broken one of the cardinal rules. You never give a title that invites a single word no. But too late for that. This is project is a new departure for me, and I'm still at a relatively early stage. So I was told the seminar was an opportunity to try out a few ideas, and that's very much the spirit in which I'm going to be speaking. I think the best way to introduce what I'm going to talk about is to start with an early but very important document in the history of the Irish diaspora. This is the report on the condition of the Irish poor in Great Britain that was produced in 1834 by George Cornwall Lewis. Cornwall Lewis, of course, is at the start of a very long career, which is going to see him become a Poor Law Commissioner, at one point a Home Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Secretary for War, as well as being an editor at one stage of the Edinburgh Review. But here he's a young man taking his first steps in public life. He produces his report on the Irish poor in Great Britain at the end of a year's work, including 4 months visiting the main centres of Irish settlement in Scotland and England. And the report presents a very striking mixture of acute observation and very deep-rooted prejudice. Bringing together a very formidable array of witnesses, Lewis demonstrates to his own satisfaction that the Irish born in England and Scotland live more poorly than either the English or the Scottish working class. They're housed in cellars and the cheapest lodgings, with whole families crowded into a single unfurnished room, often sharing a single bed. Their diet, as no homeland, is dominated by milk and potatoes. Their employment is mainly unskilled, what he calls work of a coarse, repulsive and often unwholesome character, things like the manufacture of soap or chemicals or sugar refining, where the stench, the heat and the physical danger make them unattractive to the indigenous population. Now, all of these disadvantages, Lewis was quite clear, are the fault of the Irish themselves. They're self-inflicted. If the Irish live in squalor, he argues, it's not because they're any more poorly paid than their English or Scottish counterparts. It's because they choose to work no more than they need to maintain their existing low standard of living. If they do have any spare money, they spend it in drink. And other problems, similarly, are problems of low expectations. One quotation will probably stand for many. This is a Liverpool dispensary doctor whom he interviewed. With respect to cleanliness, both of persons and dwellings, and in attention to comfort, the Irish are much inferior to the English and Welsh. They seem to be as contented amidst dirt and filth and close, confined air as in clean and airy situations. What other people would consider comforts, they appear to have no desire for. Similarly, Lewis argues the absence of the Irish in skilled occupations is not due to any discrimination, but what he called a moral deficiency. They just lack the capacity for taking pains, the habit of care and perseverance that's required of a skilled tradesman. And he also worries that the willingness of the Irish to crowd into substandard housing makes them a menace to public health, and the drunken brawling tends to overwhelm a police force that's designed to deal with the more tractable British population. And they're also shameless, he argues, in exploiting any available charity. The Irish almost always make an effort to get something for nothing. Now, to the modern reader, all this has a depressingly familiar ring. They have very similar complaints about an immigrant underclass, largely responsible for its own degraded condition, and posing a threat to the morals and stability of the whole society. Those sort of complaints are going to be repeated over and over again over the next 2 centuries. Just as they continue to be heard today. Nevertheless, the reason I've started with Lewis is, despite his obvious prejudices, he was an acute and a perceptive observer. And there are 2 features in particular of his report that make it a revealing historical document rather than just a rant. The first is his conviction that what he's describing is something entirely new. The emigration from Ireland to England and Scotland, he said, is of a very remarkable character, perhaps nearly unparalleled in the history of the world. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's a young man on the way up, he's just written this report, and he doesn't want to talk up his topic. But he does actually have a serious point to make. What he argues is that past movement, migration in the past, has mainly been of two kinds. Either it has been the movement of specialist artisans to places where their skills are needed, like the arrival of the Flemish weavers in the English Midlands in the Middle Ages. And there's been migration from more to less advanced regions, as when Europeans have colonized North and South America. That's migration in the past. But what's happening in the case of the Irish migration to England, he says, is different. It has usually happened that emigrations have taken place from more civilized to less civilized nations. In other cases, where a civilized population has not forcibly occupied the territory of a savage race, the emigration has been confined to certain descriptions of artisans. But the Irish emigration to Britain is an example of a less civilized population spreading themselves as a kind of substratum beneath the more civilized community, and without excelling in any branch of industry, obtaining possession of all the lowest amount departments of human labour. A kind of substratum beneath the more civilized community, taking possession of the lowest departments of manual labour. So that's the first, an historical point, if you like. The other striking point about Lewis's report is that he is quite clear that whatever problems it has caused, the Irish presence in England and Scotland is desirable and even essential. There are contemporaries that expressed fears that the mass immigration from Ireland would force down wages in England, reduce the English working class and Scottish working classes to the same debased condition as the Irish. That's in fact why the Irish are included in the great poor inquiry of which this report forms a part. But Lewis, on the other hand, argues differently. He argues that the immigrants have in fact provided an essential additional resource, without which cotton spinning and the other new branches of manufacturing industry on which the prosperity of the kingdom depends would just not have been able to take off. Their irregular habits and low standard of comfort may be regretted, but it is to be remembered that these Irish have been and are most efficient workmen, that they came in the hour of need and they afforded the chief part of the animal strength by which the great works of our manufacturing districts have been executed. Now, so for all its deficiencies, Lewis's report is a very useful starting point for a history of the Irish diaspora, because what you've got is a sharp, if prejudiced mind, responding to the very first stages of what was to be a dramatic transformation. And Lewis is actually right when he says that what he's seeing is unparalleled, and what he doesn't know is that it is only the beginning of a worldwide phenomenon. What we have to remember is that by the time Lewis writes his report in the 1830s, European settlers had been crossing the Atlantic for the last 3 centuries. But the numbers remain modest. At the end of the 18th century, the white population of North and South America taken together is somewhere around 6 million. In Asia, you're still talking about trading stations rather than any sort of emigration. Colonization of Australia and New Zealand has just begun. So in all of these ways, numbers have been very small. Contrast that with what is going to happen over the next century or thereabouts. Now, migration figures are notoriously unreliable, so really these have to be treated primarily as orders of magnitude rather than anything else. But roughly speaking, between the 1840s and 1940, you're talking about somewhere just under 60 million Europeans crossing the Atlantic, who for the Irish, it's 1815 to 1921, needless to say, 8 million. Around the same period, again from the 1840s to 1940s, something like 48 to 52 million Indians and Chinese dispersed around the Pacific Rim. Very substantial migrations into Manchuria and Siberia, sponsored by the Russian and Chinese governments, each trying to stamp their hold on a disputed territory. 13 million Russians, 30 million Chinese. Something like 10 million existing population of USA and Canada migrating westwards to the other side of the continent. And beginning in the early 20th century, continue up to the 1970s, the African-American Great Migration from the rural South to the industrial North. What you're looking at is a huge redistribution of population around the world, of which that relatively small Irish migration to Great Britain is only the very first part. And what you're looking at is millions of people moving in response, above all, to the demand for labour. We think of the 19th century as the era of the Industrial Revolution, but when dramatic technological advances transformed the world economy. But we have to remember just how specialised the new technology is, and in the early Industrial Revolution, how limited the field in which it can be applied. Steam power can drive the machinery for simple repetitive tasks like spinning or weaving. It can propel railway engines and ships across land and ocean. But the railway lines those trains run on still have to be constructed by traditional methods, with shovel and pick and sledgehammer. And the same is true of the rest of the new communications infrastructure. Roads and canals that transform inland transport, the ports and dockyards where ships berth, the huge cities that come to dot former wildernesses have to be constructed street by street, house by house, brick by brick. The goods they produce have to be loaded and unloaded at warehouse and pier and railhead. And for all of this, the New World economy depends above all on ever-increasing amounts of human manual labour. Now, in the past, there was, of course, a very simple solution to a sudden demand for additional human manual labour: slavery. But by the early 19th century, for the first time in history, slave labour is becoming an unacceptable means of meeting the growing demand for what Cornwall Lewis called animal strength. Instead, what you've got is the new international trade in people. All around the Indian and Pacific Ocean, on tea, sugar, rubber and tobacco plantations, in Cuba, the West Indies, Malaya, East Africa, gold and mineral mines in southern Africa, on the roads and railroads that open up all these regions to international trade. All around the Pacific Rim, work that had formerly been carried out by slaves is now being done above all by a migrant population of Chinese and Indians. When Brazil abolishes slavery in the 1880s, the government sponsors the immigration of something like 4 million Spaniards, Portuguese and Italians to work on its coffee plantations. When Argentina opens up the Pampas by building railways and ruthlessly suppressing the indigenous population, they import roughly the same number of Italians and others to become tenant farmers on the new great estates on the Pampas, producing wheat and beef for European markets. In the United States, of course, Chinese labour again has its part in the West Coast. For example, it's the imported skills of Chinese workers that turn the marshlands of California's Central Valley into the country's vineyard and citrus orchard. Elsewhere in the American South and Southwest, farms and cities become dependent on the labour of migrants crossing the border from Mexico. In the east and north, what you're talking about is immigrants from southern and eastern Europe, swelling the population of the industrial cities, providing the labour for the continuing growth of manufacturing industry. In the 1920s, agitation against these undesirable Slavs and Latins lead to new ethnically based quotas for immigration. But all that means is that the closing of America's open door leads to a huge rise in immigration from Filipinos, Mexicans, West Indians, as well as, what I mentioned earlier, the northward migration of African Americans. I could go on. Of course, after 1945, it's Europe's turn to deal with what quickly becomes an immigrant problem when the British, the French, the Germans all set about importing labour to rebuild their shattered economies. Today, you've got the same exchange of population, the only difference being that it is now extended beyond Western countries to, for example, the oil-rich states of the Middle East and to some of the tiger economies of Asia itself, importing Asian and North African labours. And the point is that in all of these cases, what Cornwall Lewis described is what is happening. Once again, the immigrants become a substratum within a host society that frets about the threat they provide to its morals and its social stability, while at the same time it comes to depend on them the host society comes to depend on them for the most necessary and least desirable forms of manual labour. So what Cornwall Lewis observed in the alleyways and cellars of the Irish areas of Glasgow and Liverpool, what he sees as a development without historical precedent, has become, today, in an ever more interconnected world, it has become the norm. So that is the background to what I'm trying to say. What I'm suggesting is a different way of looking at the Irish migration of the 19th and 20th centuries. Books on Irish migration, Irish emigration. Oh, sorry, there's two authors in one here. So some books on Irish emigration begin with a series of set images that supposedly explain what the Irish diaspora is all about. Mud-walled thatched hovels, tyrannical landlords, a repressive alien government, famine, so on and so forth. But from another point of view, as that table makes clear, what we're looking at, what we're seeing in Ireland, is just one part of something much bigger. A massive reordering of the world that redistributes tens of millions of people to different parts of the globe to serve the needs of a new international economy. So what do we gain if we take this alternative perspective? Easiest way, I think, to show what we gain, or to suggest what we gain, is to look at a concrete example. We have some letters from John McBride of Derryaghy, who in 1819, at the age of 27, sails from Belfast to St. John, New Brunswick. Like many others, he has chosen the cheaper crossing to British North America, but his destination is the United States. He travels by land to Lubec, which is just inside the main border here, and then by ship to New York. His eventual destination, he hopes, is Philadelphia, because he's been told that there are good prospects for weavers in Philadelphia, and he is a weaver. However, he has picked a bad time to come, because in 1819, a 2-year speculative boom has just burst, and the American economy has plunged into recession. He stays with a relative in New York and attempts to find work there initially without success. He then tours factories in outlying towns, Newark, Bloomfield and elsewhere, again looking for work, but finds that they are shedding labour rather than taking on new hands. He finally finds work in Paterson in New Jersey, but complains that the wages are poor, the cost of living is high. However, within a few months, he has moved on. And he moves on right up here to the northwestern corner of New York State, to Watertown, on the fringe of the Great Lakes. And there he finds work as a weaver much more happily. By 1822, he is married, he's living in a house that he owns, and he's combining his weaving job with little market gardening on the side, and is writing home very confidently about his prospects in the United States. Now, John McBride is interesting because he's a transitional figure, but he's a transitional figure in two ways. The first and most obvious one is in terms of where he comes from and his cultural background. He is very much a typical example of the sort of immigrant who has dominated the Irish emigration to North America since it began in the years around 1720. He's a skilled worker of an Ulster Protestant background, a weaver from County Antrim. Within a relatively short time, within just over a decade of his arrival, however, people like him continue to come, of course, but they are increasingly being, from the 1830s onwards, they're being outnumbered by a very different type of Irish migrant. Catholic rather than Protestant, drawn from a much wider geographical area, and unskilled, with nothing to sell but their labour. So, in that sense, McBride is a figure from an earlier phase of migration. But he's also transitional in another way. The problems which he encounters finding work in the United States and the solution he eventually finds to those problems reflect major changes that are taking place just at this time in the American economy, and that over the next few decades are going to change the face of Irish immigration. After he'd been established in Watertown for a few years, McBride looks back on his early days in the United States, and he is quite clear on why he found it so hard to prosper in New York and Paterson and elsewhere. He says you're too close to New York, the main port of arrival, so that people land without a shilling in their pocket and glut the market for unskilled labour. In addition, in New York, imported manufactured goods are too easily come by. And therefore, there isn't work for skilled tradesmen like him. You're dealing with imported English fabrics. By moving 350 miles or so, 250 miles is the figure he gives, to Watertown, on the other hand, he moves away from the problems created by New York. Watertown is a relatively recent settlement. This is quite surprising given that it's New York State, but it had been established only in 1800. On rough terrain, the main advantage was the local river, Black River, which had potential for industrial power. 17 years ago, McBride reports this place was one continued wilderness. Now, however, there is a cotton factory, and he makes a good living weaving in the cotton factory, producing the goods needed by the local population. In other words, he has solved his problem. He hasn't moved off to the frontier, which by now is over here. He hasn't moved to the frontier, but he's moved to an intermediate region between the new frontier settlement and the more settled districts to the east, to a place where it's a region where women still buy cloth from a local outlet and make it up into clothes for themselves and their family, where local craftsmen turn out pots, pans and other small metal goods for a local market. So his problem is solved. It is only solved, however, because this is 1819, 1820. It's still before the transport revolution, before the construction of a great network of first canals and then railways, which is going to allow the cities of the east to become suppliers to the whole settled, populated parts of North America, producing cheap, mass-produced manufactured goods for an ever-widening domestic market. John McBride arriving 20 or 30 years later in the 1850s or the 1860s would no longer have been able to get away from the competition of cheap mass-produced manufactured goods by travelling a few hundred miles inland. Anywhere he went, he would still be facing mass production from the major industrial cities. So, the reason this economic background is important is because there is a well-established tradition that casts the history of the Irish immigrant population in the United States in terms of a narrative of sharp decline. It begins with the experience of people like John McBride, skilled workers or farmers who come equipped with some modest capital and who emigrate to colonial America or the early Republic and manage to establish themselves successfully in the middle ranks of American society as farmers or independent tradesmen. And this success story is then contrasted with the very different experience of immigrants of the mid and late 19th century who instead become a poorly paid labouring class. But the point is, the details of John McBride's westward journey suggest we need to put this in a broader context. We already know from the work of David Doyle and others that the idea that the post-famine Irish of American cities are all navvies or dockers. That is a myth. Most of them are in fact employed in manufacture of one kind or another. But the manufacture in which they work is large-scale production for an ever-expanding market of the kind made possible by the transport revolution. What you're dealing with is an industrial labour market where any skills that are needed are picked up in months rather than in the years required for a formal British-style apprenticeship. Richard Stott talks about mediocre skills. And in fact, if you look at the know-nothing movement of the 1850s, for example, what you're looking at is precisely the response to this development of the sort of industrious mechanics that have been the backbone of urban society in the age of Jefferson or Jackson, but who now find themselves being overwhelmed by a tide, mainly immigrant, of unskilled or semi-skilled workers. So, in other words, what is seen as a decline in the status of the Irish immigrant is in fact part of a much broader 19th century remaking of the American working class. And it's a remaking that depends above all on immigrant labour, on an unending supply of cheap immigrant labour to provide the basis of this new type of manufacturing. I'll just pause here for a second. I'm uneasily aware at this point, it sounds as if I'm talking solely about male migration, where of course the distinctive feature of Irish immigration in the 19th century is the extent to which it is an immigration of women just as much as men. Some of these female immigrants become part of the same army of cheap labour that made American industrialisation such a runaway success, whether they work in factories or as outworkers in the garment trade or similar areas. A high proportion become domestic servants, and there's a parallel narrative to be gone into there about how the contribution of Irish women in domestic service, the part it plays in the development of a particular type of consumer society. But I'm trying to keep this fairly short and fairly broad. So, as I say, one way in which this new focus to look on Irish migration in the context of worldwide redistribution of new labour force, it does give us a new perspective on what's normally seen as the decline in status of the Irish immigrant. Other aspects too, the perspective of international migration allows us to reassess some common assumptions. There's been a lot of discussion over the years about the apparent contradiction of the Irish, a rural agricultural people, ignoring the attractions of the frontier for the towns and cities of the East, becoming industrial workers rather than homesteaders. Once again, of course, the stereotype is misleading. We now know, thanks to a lot of work by that in Canada and Australia, Irish immigrants, Catholic as well as Protestant, did play a prominent part in extending the frontier of settlement to cultivation and do emerge as a farming class. Even in the United States, there are Irish immigrants in the late 19th century who still take this route. Malcolm Campbell points out that if you look at Wisconsin in 1861, the Irish, in fact, make up are the largest foreign-born group in Wisconsin, making about 1/5 of the foreign-born, and more than half of them work in agriculture, more commonly as farmers rather than labourers. So there are still people going to the frontier. But there is a question of numbers here. Even if you could overcome the formidable logistical difficulties, there's no way that 30 million immigrants arriving in the United States from 1815 to 1914 could all have been found places on the frontier, or areas of new cultivation or new territories like California. Immigration at that scale could only take place in the context of the massive growth of American industrial production and infrastructural development. Sheer numbers, in other words, dictate that the new arrivals, including the Irish, are going to be urban and industrial rather than pioneering homesteaders. That's what creates the demand for their presence, and that's where they go, and that's what they do. Finally, putting Irish immigration in its comparative context draws attention to what is in fact distinctive about the Irish diaspora. It's chronology. In Eastern and Southern Europe, the age of mass migration begins only in the 1870s. In Ireland, you have a combination of geographical location and the precocious commercialisation that comes with integration into the British economy. And this means that large-scale movement begins a full 4 decades earlier in the 1830s. The Irish are in fact the largest single group entering the United States between 1830 and 1860, accounting for just under 2 million out of 5 million immigrants. And I think this is part of our problem. Chronology aligns the Irish with the British and the Germans, the two other main immigrant groups before 1870. But the economic basis of their migration aligns them with the Italians, the Poles, and the other southern and eastern Europeans who are going to arrive much later in the century. And that's, I think, one reason for the widespread assumption that the economic experience of the Irish in the United States represents a failure that has to be somehow explained. Compared to the British and the Germans, the Irish do poorly. Compared to the Italians and the Poles, they are not at a disadvantage. So we come back to conclude to Cornwall Lewis. What he spotted correctly in his report, for all its flaws, was that the Irish were pioneering a new type of migration, driven by ever-expanding demand for labour, marking out a path that millions more in Eastern and Southern Europe would follow. And when the Irish diaspora is seen in that context, much about it becomes easier to understand. In particular, we can understand the jobs which the Irish find themselves doing, whether they become canal road and rail builders. Remember Marx's great description of the navvies as the light infantry of capitalism, a mobile labour force that goes where this sort of work has to be done. Or as semi-skilled workers in a new type of manufacturing industry. All this becomes easy to understand. And finally, it also helps to explain something about their political development. For the Irish, particularly in their most common destination, the United States, they also enjoy the rewards of being pioneers. Arriving early, sharing the language and the culture of the society to which they emigrate, they achieve something of a privileged position in the immigrant world. By the end of the 19th century, the Irish had become, in many ways, the gatekeepers to the New World for those who come after them. For a Pole or an Italian or a Ukrainian arriving in New York or similar cities at the late 19th, early 20th century are confronted with established Irish, not part of the elite, but nevertheless occupying what from the immigrant's position are the essential positions of power. This is the social reformer Emery Bouch writing in 1910. The newcomers encountering Irish policemen, Irish politicians, Irish bureaucrats, Irish saloon keepers and Irish teachers could be excused for thinking that Irish equaled American. The chronology also helps us to understand something about the political development of the Irish, but also, I think, to look a bit more realistically at their economic fortunes in their new home. Thank you.